the European conflict has started to change course. Germany's military fate was set in stone by 1944, as the Reich was losing ground on the Eastern Front and Allied soldiers were advancing across France. However, the front line's collapse also carried with it a different, more subdued tale. Women assigned to auxiliary forces were among the tens of thousands of German captives who were relocated far from the front lines. Across the Atlantic, in the very center of the United States, their trip came to an end instead than in improvised camps in Europe. Captivity took on a new meaning for these ladies. They saw a country of plenty when they first arrived in America, not the weapons that had demolished the fortifications of their homeland. The towers and fencing may have been familiar when trains moved into restricted facilities. What transpired within the gates wasn't. The earliest glances were seen on trays in the mess hall, where food was displayed in amounts that people who had experienced German rationing could not have imagined. Stacks of white, fluffy bread were spread out. The substantial portions of meat, which could be either beef or chicken, were enough to startle women who had been used to leftovers. Vegetables were served in generous portions rather than by the teaspoon. On other days, baskets of fresh fruit, such as oranges and apples, emerged as shining representations of a place unaffected by shortage. It was a startling contrast. Food had become a daily struggle in Germany. By 1943, all meals were determined by ration cards. Turnips were boiled and made into thin soups by families. Loaves that little resembled bread were stocked in bakeries by replacements. Coffee, sugar, and butter were long gone from everyday tables. Hunger had been a constant for many of the women now inside American walls. The asymmetry of the battle was exposed when one entered a camp where tables groped with food. There was more to this wealth than just good fortune. It represented America's distinct role in the World War. The United States had mobilized its crops and industries without the destruction that engulfed Europe, protected from direct attack by oceans. The Midwest was covered in unbroken wheat fields. Harvests were transported to ports and depots with unparalleled efficiency via railroads and roadways. The amount of beef supplied by cattle ranches was far greater than what Germany could produce while under siege. The scale caught the inmates' attention right away. Women were reported to have whispered incredulously when they observed kitchens filled with canned items and milk that was delivered in glass bottles. Even the camp guards, who were frequently young men who had not experienced starvation, reflected a different reality. Their boots fit properly, their outfits were pressed, and their food were on par with or superior to those given to convicts. They had anticipated a tired, ration-poor picture of war, but this was not it. The Geneva Convention's requirement that detainees be fed to the same level as American troops was upheld by the U.S. government. However, the impact went beyond the legislation. Every meal became a powerful statement. The German women realized that America must provide its soldiers in the field with unimaginable supplies if it could spare such food for prisoners. The quantity on their plates demonstrated that an agricultural and industrial machine was functioning on a scale that could not be concealed by propaganda. The shock was emotionally taxing for some inmates. The justification for the war they had backed was necessity and homeland defense. However, as they sat in front of seemingly endless food platters, they started to realize a bigger reality. Germany was fighting against a country with unmatched resources in addition to military. Empty bellies could not be satisfied by ideology. America's wheat fields were now just as important as its bombers. Though prohibited, letters home occasionally alluded to these encounters. Families in Germany who were dealing with bombs and shortages were given detailed descriptions of meals that seemed unreal. While their own cabinets were empty, mothers and fathers found it difficult to envisage their daughters eating daily meals of bread and meat. The contrast between life at home and life in captivity became surreal as a result of these views of America's riches. The abundance represented more than comfort from a strategic standpoint. It strengthened camp discipline. Well-fed inmates were simpler to manage, less likely to revolt, and less likely to get sick. However, it also had psychological effects outside of prison. Many women later noted that it was food, not weaponry, that gave them their first real appreciation of America's power. The meals served as silent evidence to them that Germany had joined a war it was unable to win. Long after the battle was over, the significance lingered in people's memories. The memory of America's crammed mess halls persisted for those who returned to a broken homeland. It came to represent the powerhouse that had emerged on the other side of the seas, a force whose triumph was recorded not just in steel and weaponry, but also in the common plenty of everyday existence. These initial experiences with American cuisine are the start of a more significant discovery as the tale of captivity develops. Bread and meat would be followed by water, bathing, and other contemporary conveniences that Germany could not provide. The captives had already been shocked by the quantity of food in the American camps, which exposed a glaring disparity between the worlds of plenty and scarcity. However, the next surprise for many of the German women came in the form of a glass bottle rather than a plate. Small, gloomy, and metal-capped, it was ordinary to Americans but astonishing to prisoners. They tried Coca-Cola for the first time at this point. Canteens constructed inside the compounds served the beverage. It started out as a standard rations line, with bottles piled behind counters and strong letters stamped on the labels. It was an odd sight to the women who came forward. Ersatz coffee and watered beer were considered the extent of indulgence in the Germany they had grown up in, when liquids were rationed to necessity. They were now presented with a bottle of bubbling sweetness for the first time. During the war, Coca-Cola had already come to represent American manufacturing. The firm, which produced the beverage in large numbers, had accompanied American troops abroad, making sure that soldiers could enjoy it whether they were in France, Kansas, or North Africa. The possibility that such a foodstuff could be given to prisoners was a revelation in and of itself to German POWs. It described an industrial basis so vast that luxury goods entered captivity just as readily as essentials. The reaction was instantaneous when the bottles were opened. Those used to weak beer or still water had never heard the hiss of carbonation. At the neck, a glimmer of bubbles rushed upward as the liquid foamed. A few women hesitantly took a drink, taken aback by the acrid sweetness that brushed their tongues. Astonished that such a drink could exist during a time of war, others drank more eagerly. It went beyond simple refreshment. A fresh form of power was encountered, an empire of manufacturing that could mass-produce even leisure. One must recall the circumstances inside Germany in order to comprehend the shock. Rationing had become so severe by 1942 that sugar was virtually non-existent in everyday life. Families used alternatives to extend scarce supplies. Candy was rarely tasted by kids. Weak surrogates made from roasted barley or chicory were the only beverages available. Thus, the introduction of Coca-Cola was a surprise in two ways. It tasted like sugar and something completely different. According to other stories, the women compared the taste to syrups or medications they had previously encountered while whispering to one another in shock. This was different, though. It was bubbly, contemporary, and oddly upbeat. A bottle of Pepsi provided an almost unreal moment of escape amidst security towers and barbed wire barriers. For the few seconds it took to drink, the weight of the conflict appeared to stop. However, Coca-Cola's presence had more significance than just novelty. It symbolized American logistics' global reach. Crates of bottled soda were sent to far-off battlefields by the same networks that brought tanks, planes, and rations. No troop division was as crucial as this industrial web. In their hands, the German women saw evidence of a supply system that was far more extensive than anything their country could handle. The decision to provide such beverages to the U.S. military was not made by accident. Coca-Cola supported American soldiers' home comforts and was associated with morale. Its use in prisoner canteens consequently had a side effect of showing prisoners that America could be generous even when they were imprisoned. It was a modest yet impactful statement. A country whose power extended well beyond survival was one that could afford to provide luxury for its inmates. The effect on the mind persisted. Later, some ladies reported that one of their most vivid memories of being held captive was the taste of their first Coca-Cola. It was not because the drink was particularly noteworthy, but rather because it exposed a stark industrial and cultural divide. Everyday life in Germany was characterized by scarcity. Even convicts in America were able to grasp bottles that were delicious and bubbly. The prisoners' recognition grew as a result of this discovery. America's war effort would involve more than just troops and weapons if it could attain such abundance. It would involve entire systems built for scale. The factories that made soda were connected to the factories that made bombers. Bottle crates may be transported by the same trains that transported tanks. Across a continent that was unaffected by the destruction engulfing Europe, everything moved in unison and rhythm. The German leadership was also aware of the repercussions. Conditions in American facilities were described in reports that came back following Red Cross inspections and prisoner exchanges. The reality was more difficult to stifle, even while official propaganda rejected them. Word got out that prisoners were fed well and were given access to things that were not available in the Reich. These tales exposed the material disparity influencing the result of the war and challenged the idea of German superiority. The recollection of that initial taste became symbolic for the women. It was connected to sensations of dislocation, awe, and awareness that a new world was replacing theirs. Although it wasn't a weapon, Coca-Cola helped explain why the war couldn't be won. Tanks and firearms were not the sole indicators of industrial strength. It was evaluated based on its capacity to create sweetness, store it in glass bottles, and even transport it into captivity. The novelty diminished, but the lesson persisted as the war stretched on and they were imprisoned. A paradigm shift was brought about by the Coca-Cola bottles in the canteen. The women came to understand that they were more than just POWs. They saw a country so rich in resources that even the tiniest pleasures were burdened with the weight of triumph. America's abundance, from the taste of bread to the glitz of Coke, was changing how they perceived the war. And soon, food and drink would not be the last surprises. Other discoveries were in store, contemporary conveniences that would make an equally enduring impression. In a world where scarcity had characterized their existence, the inmates had been haunted by the delicious shock of Coca-Cola, a reminder of industrial wealth. However, that perception had just been solidified when another surprise, this time in plates rather than bottles, appeared. Bread, meat, and condiments were combined to create a dish that was different from anything they had in their kitchens. This was the first time the German women confined behind the wire had ever seen an American hamburger. Constructed with military accuracy, the prisoner mess halls were intended to feed thousands of inmates at regular times. The sound of trays clattering blended with the stern voices of soldiers enforcing discipline as long wooden tables were arranged in rows. American cooks labored in more industrial than domestic settings within the kitchens. They didn't use household ovens or little pots to cook. Instead, they fed a system where food was measured in hundreds and thousands rather than servings of 10 using institutional pans and field stoves. Every action was driven by efficiency. Within this framework, the hamburger became a commonplace supper. For Americans, the dish was a familiar, virtually everyday combination of bread, condiments, and ground hamburger that was served hot in a bun. It was shocking to the inmates. German culinary traditions placed a strong emphasis on boiling meats, sausages, and rich breads that were frequently spiced out of need rather than preference. It was unfamiliar to think of minced meat formed into patties and sandwiched between soft bread rolls. The light bread covering meat flavored with pickles, mustard, or onions even seemed strange. Some women paused when the platters were first passed across the counter. In contrast to the soups and stews that dominated German wartime meals, the appearance alone seemed odd. Others took the meal with caution, scrutinizing the straightforward bread and patty combination as though it were a relic from a different culture. It tasted robust and odd at first, like the richness of seasoned and fried beef. It carried a sense of luxury that was hard to reconcile with confinement for people used to sparse meals pushed thin by substitutes. America's logistical prowess was demonstrated by the size of these meals. In the U.S., ground beef had been rationed, but the supply never ran out. Millions of cattle were transported by farms throughout the Midwest, using rail networks that had not been damaged by bombing. After processing, the beef passed through commissaries and depots before arriving to prisoner camps, where thousands of patties were made by cooks. The fact that hamburgers were served in mess halls demonstrated that the same equipment used to construct tanks and bombers could also reliably provide food for prisoners. German inmates frequently likened these meals to their experiences back home, according to historical reports. By the middle of the war, Meat rations in Germany had decreased to once-weekly thin pieces that were frequently topped with organ or horse meats. Women have to substitute potatoes or cabbage for proteins in order to lengthen their meals. To see so much ground beef and so simply prepared was to see the difference between an economy besieged and one that had not been destroyed by strategic bombardment. The women's reactions were a combination of incredulity and interest. Some people remarked on how odd it was to eat with condiments so readily available. Sliced pickles and mustard in jars, for example, without ration cards. Others were astounded by the bread itself, which was light and delicate in contrast to Germany's substantial rye loaves. Every component discussed differences in distribution, milling, and agriculture. For the hostages, what was considered common cafeteria fare became a sign of industrial confidence. According to several POWs' later memories, the hamburger had symbolic significance that went beyond the actual food. Because it was uniform, efficient, and pragmatic, it appeared to represent American culture. It was food that could be produced indefinitely, that didn't need to be prepared in a complicated way, and that could be served rapidly to large groups of people. In this way, it reflected the larger American strategy for war, mass production intended to satisfy demands quickly and forcefully. This was a startling realization for German women who were accustomed to cooking stews at home and using local recipes. Nutrition was not the only effect. The way people saw captivity was also influenced by these meals. They were greeted with simple but satisfying meals that were new to them rather than ones that were scarce and depriving. By reducing opposition and reminding prisoners of the differences between countries, the gesture changed morale. The assurance with which America could introduce even traditional foods into prisoner camps left an effect, not only charity. Such meals had a strategic impact that extended beyond morale. The Allied war effort's logistical foundation was highlighted by the capacity to feed large numbers of prisoners without experiencing any hardship. In addition to maintaining its own soldiers across several continents, the United States was also in charge of providing for the fundamental needs of hundreds of thousands of enemy prisoners. This capability bolstered a perception of boundless power. For German captives, the sight of continuous convoys and hamburgers in the meal hall were both indicators of unmatched riches. Many people remembered these lunches long after the war was over. Reluctant adoration mixed with surprise as several ladies recalled their first hamburger. The image was shaped by what the delicacy disclosed about cultural priorities rather than the delicacy itself. The hamburger was democratic, effective, and portable. Both soldiers and convicts could eat it. The prisoners saw, in a single meal, not only the food of another country but also the social and industrial forces that influenced it. The women took with them more than the flavor of bread and meat as the trays were cleaned and the mess halls were cleansed. They carried with them the understanding that American might was not just found in weaponry but also in the capacity to sustain life on a large scale using techniques that were foreign to them yet incredibly successful. Every interaction, from the Coca-Cola bottles to the hamburger plates, made them more conscious of the enormous cultural gap that separated their native country from the authority that now controlled them. As the prisoners soon came into contact with another aspect of American life, one that was connected to music and rhythm rather than food, reverberating via radios and jukeboxes, that separation would only widen. The German women prisoners had only started to process the shock of hamburgers in the meal halls when they came to another discovery. As each day went by, it became clear that the food was not an exception but rather a component of an apparently infallible system. Not the meals per such, but the sheer variety that came consistently. A diversity that was unimaginable under the blockade that choked Europe was what shocked the visitors the most. Their relatives in Germany were going through one of the most hopeless periods of the war by the time these women were taken prisoner and shipped across the Atlantic. The air and sea barriers had been strengthened by the Allied blockade. Once brimming with tropical products, coffee, and grain, merchant shipping lanes have been blocked off. Food processing facilities, warehouses, and railroad hubs had all been destroyed by bombing strikes. For citizens, everyday existence turned into a battle for survival rather than comfort. Their tables were laden with substitutes. Meals bulked out with turnips or other low-value crops, butter substituted with synthetic spreads, coffee made from roasted barley or chicory. When protein was present, it was quantified in scraps. In light of this, the American camps seemed like a completely different reality. Deliveries came in a constant cadence in the kitchens. Fresh meat, flour, and milk were delivered by trucks. Crates of vegetables emerged, heaped high and handed out by men who seemed to have no scarcity. It was the natural result of a continent whose fields had never been bombed, whose crops flowed across railroads that ran uninterrupted from coast to coast, and the abundance was not a show put on for prisoners. The difference was nearly confusing to women who recalled standing in line with ration cards. In this place, eggs with clean, abundant shells were served boiled in the morning. Made from wheat that was harvested in plains where harvests increased year after year, the bread arrived soft and white. Even fruits, apples, peaches, and oranges, which are frequently a relic in Germany, came in tins or, throughout the summer, in fresh bowls. Their native country had not seen these products in many years. The influence extended beyond just sustenance. Every meal turned into a silent protest of the two countries' economic disparity. The food system of Germany, which was engaged in an attrition-based war, had collapsed due to the combined effects of bombing, blockade, and complete mobilization. With the oceans protecting it, America's agricultural output has reached all-time highs. To increase yields, farmers made investments in mechanization, such as tractors, combines, and irrigation systems. Surpluses were bought by the government and sent through military channels. Incorporating prisoner camps into that extensive supply chain made them improbable receivers of the surplus. According to certain historical accounts, the women were impressed not just by the gifts they received but also by how casually they were presented. No ceremony was held, and there was no sign that they were receiving a unique privilege. For the Americans, eating was not a home issue but a habit quantified in tons and calories, and a component of logistics charts. Captives who recalled wiping pots clean at home would be shocked to see scraps being thrown away or fed to camp animals. To them, waste appeared to be an unthinkable luxury. It had deep strategic significance. In addition to being a humanitarian decision, feeding inmates was a purposeful act of protest. It demonstrated the breadth of America's supply chain, a machine capable of feeding millions of men abroad, arming ships, and providing variety to those confined behind barbed wire. The reality was clear to German women who were used to hearing that the blockade would starve Britain or destroy Allied morale. Their own society had been starved to the point of vulnerability, while the Allies were still well supplied. Later, historians noted that the availability of food evolved into a subtle yet effective psychological warfare tactic. Each plate of excess conveyed, without words, that the American war effort was not burdened but flourishing. The fruit, coffee, and hamburgers all demonstrated that this was a country whose factories and farms operated on a scale that a besieged Europe could not equal. These impressions were carefully, and frequently silently, carried by the ladies. Some cautiously but tellingly wrote about them in home letters that were censored. In Germany, descriptions of whole dinners, butter and jam, sweet beverages, and freshly baked bread were almost unbelievable to families. Such stories sounded almost like fantasy to them. The experience was real for the prisoners, though, as they lived day in and day out inside the American camps. The effects persisted after the conflict. Upon the return of peace, the memories of American abundance contrasted sharply with the memories of meager soups and ersatz coffee. Some people's perceptions of America were shaped by food, which represented abundance beyond bombing and blockade, rather than by soldiers or weaponry. The tale of food abundance was only one aspect of the larger cultural shock, as Chapter 4 concludes. The women would soon experience not only the range of meals but also the mechanisms that provided them, including mess halls, kitchens, and canteens driven by industrial order. They started to realize how intricately American resources were set up for both life and war in those areas and throughout the regular mealtime pattern. German prisoners' perceptions of America had already been altered by the memory of piled high dinners. Bread and meat were plenty, but that was just the start. The little pleasures that crept into meals without fanfare, day after day, were what really shocked them. Real coffee, chocolate bars, and sugar packets, things that were missing from their native country, spoke louder than any pamphlet ever thrown over Europe. These similar things were practically legendary in Germany. By 1943, only a trickle of sugar was available, mostly for hospital patients or children. Coffee had virtually disappeared, to be replaced by harsh alternatives made from acorns or roasted barley. Once brought from South America and colonies, chocolate completely vanished under the embargo. The conflict made such things a thing of the past for citizens. With the exception of seizing Allied supplies, even frontline soldiers hardly ever tasted them. However, the converse was true in American camps. Granulated sugar packets showed up on tables every morning, poured into tin cups of boiling coffee that had a decidedly real scent. The beans had been transported from the Caribbean, Brazil, and Colombia, passing through American ports unhindered by the enemy. The hemisphere's supply lines were guarded by merchant convoys and naval patrols that were spared the destruction of German vessels. Chocolate was distributed as casually as bread, neatly wrapped in familiar bars. These were military rations made to provide troops energy, in addition to being commercial brands. What American soldiers took into war now ended up in the hands of their prisoners was a stark irony. The first mouthful was both delightful and shocking for women who had not seen chocolate in years. The extent of American resources was demonstrated by the volume of production that went into these pleasures. Refined in day and night operations, sugar streamed in from Louisiana, Cuba, and Hawaii. Even when millions of troops moved overseas, hundreds of thousands of tons of coffee were imported to keep civilian stores stocked. From Pennsylvania to Illinois, chocolate companies produced both specialized ration bars and well-known confections, while alternating smoothly between military contracts and civilian supplies. Such things did more for the inmates than only sate their desires. It conveyed a subliminal sense of industrial power. What were the real boundaries for America if it could save coffee and chocolate for its adversaries? German propaganda at home had claimed that the Allied countries were on the verge of disintegrating and that their citizens were starving as a result of rationing and bombardment. Here, however, all of the claims were refuted by the evidence. According to some later stories, the women inmates thought that the most obvious indication of difference was sugar. Its absence had changed everyday life in Germany. Simple, austere meals had taken the place of cakes, pastries, and even sweetened tea. The resurgence of sugar in America was not only gastronomic but also symbolic, signifying a thriving economy that could provide sweetness to even those confined by barbed wire. It had a mild but lasting effect. Historians observe that ordinary encounters repeated until they become unavoidable frequently have a greater psychological influence than large gestures. A chocolate bar distributed every day could not be written off as hyperbole, but a brochure might. Each component served as proof that America's war machine was fueled by an unlimited supply of both luxury and necessity. The story extended beyond the boundaries of the camp to worldwide strategy. Through initiatives like the Good Neighbor policy, the United States had established crucial trade ties throughout the Western Hemisphere, guaranteeing the continued flow of cocoa, sugar, and coffee northward. Additionally, goods arrived in American ports undamaged thanks to naval dominance in the Atlantic. Germany, on the other hand, was constantly short on resources due to its blockade. As a result, it was impossible to ignore the contrast. In an American camp, a German woman drinking real coffee was aware that her mother back home was consuming bitter root-brewed ersatz. Here, sugar was measured in paper packets, but in Germany, a child might not taste it again until the end of the war. Long forgotten in Europe, chocolate unexpectedly reappeared in her hands, unwrapped in shock. These disclosures were strategic as well as personal. Both civilians and captured troops unwittingly witnessed the extensive supply networks that supported Allied power. Their subsequent statements supported the intelligence officers' presumption that economic might was just as important as military triumphs. America's unrestricted supply of sugar, coffee, and chocolate was not an indulgence. Rather, it was a result of manufacturing that no rival could match. The effects were not limited to the years of the war. These minor comforts were later referred to by many ex-offenders as their first genuine taste of America's reach. The aroma of coffee or the taste of chocolate become associated with the awareness of overwhelming strength rather than ease. These products, in their opinion, provided a better explanation of the war's conclusion than lectures or maps. They were indisputable and appetizing evidence that Germany's adversaries had used resources that were unthinkable. These impressions grew stronger as the war approached its conclusion. The fact that America fought from wealth rather than scarcity was reaffirmed with each ration. Chocolate, coffee, and sugar were the subdued emblems of a system that provided for soldiers, aided friends, and still provided more than enough for prisoners. Soon, the tale of pleasures would give way to a more significant one. In addition to food and drink, prisoners would have to deal with the well-organized systems that provided these items: industrial cooks, commissaries, and canteens that were unlike anything seen in Europe during the war. What was ingested and how it was supplied with unwavering accuracy would be revealed in the following chapter. Coffee's warmth and chocolate's sweetness had already cast doubt on German inmates' perceptions of America. However, the lessons of plenty did not stop there. Daily meals within the compounds served as a platform for cross-cultural interactions. The women who sat at American dining tables saw what the guards considered ordinary as exceptional. The condiments that were served with the food were frequently the first thing that people noticed. On long wooden tables were bottles of ketchup, dazzlingly colored and seemingly limitless. Jars of mustard were passed casually from hand to hand, thick and pungent. These were essentials of daily life for the Americans. They represented extravagance that was nearly unfathomable to the women who had endured blockage. Bread came in limitless quantities. They were white, soft, and abundant, sliced in piles that never seemed to run out. Every year of war had made bread rougher and darker for German civilians. Its quality served as a reminder of scarcity, and it was carefully rationed, made from rye, potatoes, or even ground-up replacements. Now the reverse was true behind American walls. There was always more bread left over after meals than anyone could consume. These meetings turned into opportunities for conversation. American staff were seated across from German women, who occasionally spoke in halting English and other times just gestured. Regarding foods they had never seen before, they had queries. Why was ketchup so widely used? How could that much mustard be produced? What made bread seem to be endless? The simple answers carried weight. America possessed the supply systems, the industry, and the countryside to feed its prisoners and its troops. It was all so casual that it added to the cultural shock. By 1944, even commanders hardly witnessed such diversity in Germany. Turnips and cabbage had been adapted to survive the winter by families. Years before, condiments were no longer found on store shelves. They distributed those identical products without reluctance in captivity. A soft bread slice or a teaspoon of mustard were considered necessities rather than luxury items. These lunches also showed how American logistics were organized. In the Midwest, wheat was grown on an industrial scale and transported by train to mills that produced millions of pounds of flour. From then, bakeries close to the camps produced bread every day, guaranteeing that there was never a shortage. Ketchup was made from Californian and Midwest tomatoes in factories that filled countless glass bottles. Grown in Canada and the Dakotas, mustard seeds served as the raw material for jars that were shipped all throughout the country. All the things on the table indicated a greater reality. America's war effort was not just about steel industries and weaponry. The ability to organize food production at unprecedented levels was equally important. For German women who had been raised in a blockade-starved country, this reality became unavoidable. It has been said that inmates frequently discussed these meals with one another long after they had concluded. Americans, they observed, viewed food as a given, plentiful, and afterthought. For the Germans, every teaspoon of sugar and every piece of bread evoked memories of poverty. That disparity contained the crux of the conflict. One country battling with limited resources, the other fighting without ever worrying about starvation. There was more than just social interaction going on around these tables. They turned into lessons about power and economy. The women noted that if America could provide such diversity for its inmates, then it must provide even more abundant supplies for its frontline troops. On a POW table, a bottle of ketchup suggested a whole system that could support armies on 2 continents. These encounters have deep significance in their aftermath. Mealtimes in America made many ex-offenders reevaluate what strength really meant, they recounted years later. There had been talk of sacrifice and determination in German propaganda. However, there was another kind of strength present in everyday bread and condiments, quiet, tangible, and indisputable. The bounty of food exposed a kind of force as decisive as any plane or tank. The larger story of imprisonment was influenced by these impressions. The fact that Germany had joined a war against a country whose resources it could not match became more apparent with each meal. Battlegrounds demonstrated military results, but dinner tables exposed the economic underpinnings that made those results unavoidable. The thrill of ketchup bottles and mustard jars persisted as the days stretched into weeks. Rather, the realization that America lived in a world apart from the destruction of Europe was strengthened. These elements become ingrained in memory. Eating bread without ration cards, passing condiments carelessly, and conversing openly during meals. Naturally, the chapter on dining tables would lead to the following revelation. Beyond the meal itself were the systems of hospitality and service that kept everything in order, including canteens, mess halls, and kitchens that seemed to run non-stop. Soon, what started out as cross-cultural dinner conversations would develop into an organizational lesson that further highlighted America's power. Captivity's eating tables had said a lot. Bread without restrictions, unlimited condiments, and meals made with a level of ease that was unimaginable in war-torn Europe. However, another sign quickly surpassed the commonplace kitchen items for the German captives. It arrived cold, fizzy, and distinctly American in a glass bottle rather than in loaves or jars. Before the war, Coca-Cola was available in Europe, albeit in small quantities. In the 1930s, German bottling companies had been operating under license, but the product was still very uncommon. Access to it had virtually vanished by the time conflict engulfed the continent. Not many German citizens had tried it, and even fewer anticipated coming into contact with it while in prison. However, Coca-Cola accompanied American troops across oceans and evolved beyond a simple beverage. It came to symbolize the United States industry, modernism, and culture, which seemed unbreakable despite international strife. Coca-Cola crates trailed the U.S. Army ashore on beaches from Normandy to southern France, from North Africa to Sicily. To guarantee that soldiers would always have access to the beverage, engineers constructed bottling facilities close to the front. There appeared to be a second supply line behind every 100 yards gained in combat, carrying rations and ammunition as well as the fizz of a carbonated drink. German captives realized they were up against something more than a traditional enemy when they noticed the bottles piled next to gasoline drums and canned meat. They had to contend with a country whose culture and economy developed in tandem, supporting one another. It was a taste of America itself to drink Coca-Cola in 1944. The bottle's design, sweetness, and carbonation all conveyed a sense of confidence and plenty. Instead than considering it a privilege, American soldiers viewed it as a right. The difference was stark for inmates used to a life of scarcity. According to some later recollections, the alcohol appeared inextricably linked to the men who carried it, young, resolute, and supported by a home front that never seemed to run out. The beverage was only one aspect of the symbolism. The Axis could not have imagined the extent of industrial capacity that Coca-Cola represented. Building bottling facilities in freed areas while continuing to produce an astounding number of tanks, airplanes, and ships demonstrated a level of resource depth that was unmatched. According to reports, hundreds of these plants were functioning throughout Allied-held Europe and the Pacific by the conclusion of the war. They all spoke to the same fact. The U.S. could fight a global conflict without ever abandoning its comforts as a civilian nation. The ramifications were apparent to German captives who observed these procedures. Their own nation, overburdened by bombing and embargo, was unable to provide its soldiers with soft drinks, let alone bread or butter for its residents. In contrast, the American presence revealed a culture so assured of its production that it brought luxury items into combat as though they were essential. In a manner that statistics could not, a bottle of Coca-Cola next to a gun highlighted the disparity in resources. According to other reports, the hostages' response was one of surprise. A straightforward glass of soda served as evidence that they had misjudged the enemy's fortitude. The shock was amplified for the German ladies in American custody. Once little known in its native country, Coca-Cola made a comeback here, not as a rarity but as something commonplace, poured carelessly in a prisoner's mess or casually exchanged among guards. Though slight, the psychological impact persisted. Coca-Cola changed people's perceptions of Allied might, much like American chocolate and cigarettes did. It implied a sort of cultural permanency in addition to field triumph. America's way of life appeared destined to go forth, propelled by factories, glass bottles, and ships alike, even if the guns stopped firing. Coca-Cola's strategic presence demonstrated how well the U.S. handled logistics during the conflict. An infrastructure that could transport both essential and secondary items was necessary to supply the front lines thousands of miles away from home. A global supply network that functioned efficiently was witnessed by depots, railroads, and convoys. American economic superiority had long been acknowledged by German military strategists, but for those held captive, witnessing that advantage materialize in something as insignificant as a soda bottle made the truth indisputable. This revelation had obvious repercussions. Coca-Cola came to represent the inevitable loss for a lot of inmates. No amount of self-discipline or sacrifice could bridge the gap if the Americans were able to transport bubbles and sweets across the Atlantic while still fielding overwhelming armies. The beverage was more than just a refreshment. It was a declaration that America's reach was absolute, printed in glass and carbonation. Coca-Cola frequently came back to mind when former prisoners talked about their time in American hands years later. It was evidence that the war had put a country struggling to survive against a powerhouse whose agriculture, factories, and culture all worked together. The bottle was not just a drink. Placed wherever American forces marched, it served as a symbol of contemporary manufacturing. Just as rations and mealtimes demonstrated plenty, Coca-Cola demonstrated a culture inextricably linked to its military power. The lesson was obvious to the German ladies who saw it. They were vanquished by a culture that battled with both wealth and power, despite their belief that scarcity was a discipline when they started a fight. Naturally, the Coca-Cola chapter would lead into the following discovery. The world of American amusement, where jukeboxes, jazz, and the rhythm of leisure conveyed the same message of prosperity, lay beyond bottles and logos. What had started out as a pleasant flavor would soon grow into the sound of a culture that was hard to stop. Coca-Cola had shown to be more than just a beverage. It was now a bottle that accompanied soldiers from the Normandy beaches to the Italian ports, a symbol of American confidence. However, when compared to the memories of home, the significance of such luxuries became more apparent to the German women in captivity. For them, the shadow of ration cards carried the real weight of contrast. In Germany, rationing had become the norm by the end of the war. The system was first implemented in 1939 and became more stringent every year. Initially, the public was informed that it was a fairness policy that would guarantee an equal distribution of food supplies. However, the cards became into emblems of deprivation rather than security as the Allied blockade tightened and transportation was interrupted by bombing strikes. A ration card was a piece of paper with rows of tiny squares printed on it. Each square had a stamp that entitled the bearer to a certain amount of food. Every week, 2 ounces of butter. Just 1 egg if supplies allow. Small portions of meat, frequently stringy or bone-filled, were sliced. Even children's milk got limited, far beyond its natural boundaries. Black bread made from rye, potatoes, or additives like sawdust became the daily mainstay for many households. The women recalled that they needed ration stamps and cash for every shop visit. You couldn't buy any food without the stamp. Since a misplaced card may mean famine for a family, the cards themselves became a part of the everyday routine, kept in pockets and closely guarded. Growing up, children watched their moms meticulously count stamps, much like they would coins, to determine whether to spend them right away or save them for a special occasion. Conditions had gotten worse by 1943. There were reports of coffee extended with acorns, turnips taking the place of meat in stews, and fake alternatives occupying the shelves that once held real sugar and chocolate. Even shoes and clothes were rationed. Leather was swapped out for synthetic materials, and worn soles were repeatedly mended. With each month of conflict, the weight of shortage increased. The food of captivity looked astounding next to this memories. By the conclusion of the war, hamburgers in American compounds were served fresh off the grill, with soft, white buns and fattening patties that were unimaginable in Germany. Once far away and almost forgotten, Coca-Cola was spilled liberally. Butter, mustard, ketchup, and sugar showed up on tables without any cards or stamps to claim them. The women were forced to compare every bite to the rigorous accounting of the house. Even the hamburger itself was meaningful. Meat had been limited to a few ounces each week in Germany. Families would frequently stretch it by adding breadcrumbs, veggies, or any other filler they might find. The sight of an entire serving of steak prepared exclusively for convicts looked more like a display of American luxury than a meal. Every bun implied a farm that had not been hit by bombs or a supply line that had not been disrupted by blockades. The human cost of scarcity was further highlighted by the recollection of ration cards. After hours of gripping their cards while standing in enormous lines, women described discovering that supplies had ran out before their turn. When butter was available, it was applied to black bread so little that it hardly gave it a gloss. By 1944, eggs were scarce and were carefully separated to ensure that none were wasted for children or the ill. The idea that food could be provided to inmates in America without rationing seemed to be a thing of the past. When one considered the connection between propaganda and ration cards, the symbolism became even more apparent. Rationing, according to German authorities, demonstrated the nation's solidarity by requiring equal sacrifice from all citizens in order to win. Insisting that they remain resilient for the homeland, posters featured happy family eating bread and potatoes. However, beneath the posters were signs of exhaustion, hunger, and a steadily declining morale. This disparity was well known to the captive ladies, and the recollection was only heightened by American affluence. There was no escaping the strategic truth. Germany didn't have the wherewithal to fight a protracted war under blockade when it started the war. Food and raw material imports were stopped by the British Royal Navy and then by the unified Allied powers. Bombing raids strengthened the hold on the German home front by destroying factories, warehouses, and rail networks. The ration card, a tiny square of paper that exposed the boundaries of a whole war economy, served as the daily proof of these demands. For those held captive, the repercussions were severe. The women realized the disparity between cultures as well as their own hunger while they were seated in front of an American supper. America spread butter thickly on toast, but Germany rationed 2 ounces. America provided dozens of eggs by the crate, whereas Germany provided 1 every week. Additionally, American prisoners, even captives, were supplied food that seemed to be reserved for peacetime, while German youngsters grew emaciated in the debris. Every hamburger in America, some later recalled, evolved into more than just a culinary experience. It started to evoke memories of ration cards that were meticulously folded at home, worn down from frequent use, and repeatedly stamped until nothing was left. Coca-Cola evoked the taste of acorn coffee with every sip. Every morsel of white bread brought back memories of the dark, filler-filled loaves. The deprivation of the past as well as the abundance of the present caused a shock of contrast. Long after the war was over, this recollection remained. When ex-offenders thought back on their time in captivity, the food they were given frequently formed a major theme in their memories. Many saw the hamburger as a sign of American triumph and the ration card as a sign of defeat. One stood for plenty, the other for boundaries. Together, they provided a straightforward explanation of Germany's defeat in the war. Another discovery would shortly follow the chapter on ration cards. The sounds of American life, such as jazz, jukeboxes, and music that conveyed the same sense of confidence, were heard beyond the meal. What had started out as food shortage would soon give way to cultural richness. Sometimes the story of war is told in more subdued ways, although it is frequently quantified in terms of battles and bombs. We followed the experiences of German POWs as they adapted to a new norm of abundance in American society in the previous chapter. This revelation persisted in a surprising way. Food itself employed as a persuasive and subtly influencing tool. By 1944, American officials had discovered that food had the power to mold their prisoners' minds as well as their stomachs. Officials in the War Department recognized that food was more than just a means of subsistence. It was identity, power, and culture. The flavor of abundant bread or fresh fruit spoke louder than words to men and women who had suffered through years of rationing and shortages. Arriving German inmates in American camps were frequently taken aback by what they discovered on their trays. There have been reports of incredulous reactions to meat offered more than thrice a week or to the unrestricted availability of butter and milk. It was a stark contrast for those who had marched under a government that promised a 1,000-year rule. America looked to provide plenty, but the Reich had brought starvation. These impressions immediately traveled around the barracks, which were under surveillance. According to some stories, troops first developed trust around dinner tables when they compared their rations to what their families may be receiving back home, rather than during questioning. The fact that the enemy had more food for its prisoners than Germany could supply for its own people was a sobering truth. It was no accident that food was used as soft power. Washington policymakers understood the psychological impact of plenty. Inmates who were fed were less inclined to object to camp rules. They became more inclined to work together, more cooperative, and more receptive to discussions about democratic principles. In this way, nutrition became a part of a larger campaign, an unseen weapon meant to change the mind rather than the body. However, the procedure was intricate. Some German officers refused to back down, telling their men that the lavish meals were merely propaganda. They maintained that the abundance was fabricated, short-lived, and intended to erode resolve. However, it was difficult to ignore the daily proof in the chow halls. Fruit, vegetables, potatoes, and even the occasional dessert attested to a war-unshattered economy. American policymakers struck a mix between caution and compassion. In order to ensure proper nutrition and steer clear of excess that would cause criticism at home, they complied with the Geneva Convention. Public opinion demanded that convicts not be treated better than citizens, and civilian families were rationing meat, sugar, and gasoline. Nevertheless, the U.S. presented a strong, materially comfortable image within those limits. The effect went beyond specific inmates. Some Germans started to identify the American way of life with stability and security, according to observers. They were struck not only by military might but also by the capacity to preserve wealth in the face of international strife. This view alluded to a more significant reality. Resources behind the lines were just as important to victory as weapons on the front. Every meal contained silent teachings for the inmates. A piece of bread made from an abundance of wheat crops represented the might of agriculture. The timely delivery of a hot bowl of soup demonstrated logistical competence. Even coffee, which was scarce in Europe during the war, gave the impression that the country had supply lines that stretched over the oceans. Although they were small indicators, taken as a whole, they depicted a society structured for endurance. Memories of home were a common topic of conversation among inmates in the evenings. The disparity was exacerbated by letters coming in from Germany about famine and shortages. For a lot of others, it was their first-hand encounter with an unavoidable contrast. The United States fed its foes enough to spare while their home country battled to feed citizens. Official brainwashing never had the same effect on morale as this silent comparison. The daily evidence of abundance was greater than any speech or leaflet. Over time, a few inmates started to doubt the stories they had been given. Perhaps there were valuable lessons to be learned from the enemy system if it could supply so much. However, not all inmates agreed with these perceptions. Suspicion lingered among the seasoned faithful. The lunches were seen by them as a ruse to lure them into treachery. However, even their opposition recognized the gesture's impact. Food had turned into a battleground unto itself, where ideology and hunger collided and experienced twisted beliefs. The strategy's efficacy was demonstrated by the end of the war. According to reports, many ex-prisoners brought back tales of American prosperity that stood in sharp contrast to Germany's demise. The taste of meals that were more bountiful than what their families had experienced under ration cards was inextricably linked to their memories of imprisonment. The repercussions went well beyond the walls of the institution. These impressions influenced opinions of the occupying countries when post-war Germany had to rebuild. Programs for food assistance, such as school lunches and relief shipments, strengthened the perception of America as a place of abundance rather than hardship. The politics of peace were infused with the legacy of wartime cuisine. Food thus evolved beyond a daily need. It was a soft power instrument that was well considered, discreetly used, and cherished. It encapsulated the essence of what victory meant in the 20th century. The triumph of systems that could feed their people and even their prisoners, in addition to the defeat of armies. This lesson became increasingly evident as the war neared its conclusion. The mere act of setting bread on a table demonstrated the power of nations, hidden behind the battle of tanks and airplanes, beneath the tactics of generals and admirals. Food therefore conveyed its own message of authority from the chow halls of American barracks to the kitchens of freed Europe. It served as a reminder that although battles are waged with fire and steel, they are survived and remembered by providing for day-to-day necessities. The narrative progresses from these subtle struggles of vision. The taste of plenty would remain with the inmates, influencing their perceptions of defeat and the world outside of Germany. The following chapter will show how those recollections of plenty and food merged with a more comprehensive understanding of America's industrial power, a machine that transformed both factories and farmland into war machines. The final chapter demonstrated how food, which was discreetly served in American camps, evolved into a nuanced tool of influence. However, those same impressions persisted outside of captivity, particularly for German women who were POWs in the U.S. For them, food served as more than just sustenance. It was an enduring representation of the strength of contemporary America. These women had strong memories of what they had experienced on the other side of the seas when the war came to an end. Coca-Cola bottles and hamburgers were seen as more than just novelty items. They served as reminders of a civilization based on efficiency and plenty, one that could manufacture comfort in large quantities, much like it did tanks and airplanes. Moments that might have appeared routine at the time gave rise to the encounter. Food foreign to Europeans was introduced by American guards in canteens erected inside prisoner enclosures. The hamburger had an unfamiliar yet alluring flavor when it was presented with its soft bread roll and topped with pickles or onions. Alongside it, Coca-Cola's strong sweetness and unique flavor and fizz made it a liquid symbol of American enterprise. These were straightforward meals prepared from a large supply source rather than lavish feasts. They showed something fundamental to ladies who had suffered through shortages during wartime rationing. America has enough food to feed its troops overseas, its residents, and its prisoners, and still have food left over for things that were once thought of as luxuries. The meaning was potent. Each hamburger implied not only dairy, cattle, and wheat, but also the factories and farms that produced them. Each Coca-Cola bottle indicated a worldwide distribution network that could provide the same flavors from New York to Normandy. The situation was confusing for women who were brought up with propaganda that promised German superiority. The Reich's portrayal ran counter to the realities they were dealing with. Perceptions were impacted by these encounters, according to reports at the time. The spontaneous impressions of everyday life frequently proved more convincing than the systematic inquiries used in formal interrogations. Food exposed realities that were difficult to deny. The message was clear: war did not weaken the United States. Despite this, it was flourishing. The arrival of letters from home accentuated this disparity. German families described ersatz coffee, bread queues, and replacement products that were unable to fill bare shelves. In this context, the recollection of Coca-Cola and hamburgers became even more vivid. Speeches and pamphlets could never carry the weight of the abundance provided in captivity. In subsequent years, the women themselves occasionally thought back on these recollections. Even when uniforms had been replaced with civilian clothing, oral histories gathered after the war indicate that the flavor of American cuisine persisted in their memories. These flavors served as a shorthand for a whole system that had proven too large for them. To assume that all inmates welcomed these experiences without question would be deceptive. Some brushed them off as conscious manipulation attempts. The idea that food may represent power was rejected by others. However, even rejection recognized the power of influence. Recognizing that the hamburger had significance beyond its ingredients meant dismissing it as propaganda. This was the unsaid genius of abundance in terms of strategy. America's ability to provide comfort just as readily as ammo revealed a great deal about the character of its war effort. It was an industrial power that extended from factories to field kitchens, from assembly lines to mess halls. Despite not being weapons, the hamburger and Coca-Cola conveyed the triumphant narrative as well as any battlefield. By contrast, the United States seemed boundless as Germany crumbled under the weight of war. Food and equipment were transported across oceans by its convoys. Its logistics made sure that prisoners, soldiers, and civilians all had food. For the women who experienced this disparity, losing battles was only one way to assess loss. Another was having empty plates at home compared to full trays in prison. The importance persisted throughout the years following the war. Food was once again employed as a bridge by American aid programs when West Germany entered a reconstruction phase. The idea that the American presence was characterized by abundance was reaffirmed by school lunches, milk delivery, and relief shipments. These programs took on a recognizable form for ex-offenders because of their prior experiences with hamburgers and Coca-Cola. As a result, the act of serving meals became a part of the lasting memory of the battle. It left a memory that was both intensely political and intensely intimate for German women prisoners of war. Abundance came to represent the emerging new global order in which production, supply, and reach were more important for survival than rationing alone. The contemplations were depressing. These women reflected on their loss while also recalling the comforts that came with it. Their perception of what modern America meant was shaped by that paradox. The loss of a nation combined with the discovery of riches. With its depth of riches and military might, it was a nation that could project power. These perceptions eventually helped create a more comprehensive truth that was recognized throughout Europe. Soldiers were not the only ones who won the Second World War. The countries that were able to provide for their citizens, equip their armed forces, and still show kindness to those they had taken as prisoners were the ones who secured it. America was unique in that balance. The image is still visible as the documentary's plot comes to a close. Coca-Cola and hamburgers were more than just food. They served as reminders that plenty itself had turned into a deciding factor in contemporary warfare and were emblems of an industrial society. The memory remained, an enduring witness to defeat and the world that sprang from it, for those who first tasted it in captivity. Thus, the story of food, power, and prisoners comes to an end. However, the deeper contemplation persisted outside of the camps, beyond the meals and supplies. In the 20th century, those who could supply were just as likely to succeed as those who could fight.